What's up, guys? Welcome back to Amazing RC. Well, it's your boy Brian here, and today I'm going to show you guys how to shorten up your 8S Traxxas X-Maxx shocks. Now, there are a couple different applications why you might want to do this. For me right now, I'm doing speed runs with the 8S X-Maxx. This year, we're going to try to take this truck over 100 miles an hour. But along the way, I thought of a couple other ways that you might utilize this. One of which might be drag racing. Keeping this truck this low to the ground with almost no suspension to it whatsoever is really going to have this thing track straight and accumulate a lot of speed really fast. So drag racing would be another reason that you would want to use this, and possibly a road course. What you don't want to use this for is any type of bashing whatsoever. It wouldn't be safe at all in this suspension platform. So here's everything that you're going to need. One thing I do recommend is when you do this, I would do one shock at a time and leave the other 3 shocks on the truck just so that it props everything up as you're going along. I just felt that to be a bit easier. You're obviously going to need some shock oil to top things off as you go along. You're going to need a 7mm socket as well, and that's going to be for the nut that's on the inside of the shock. You're obviously going to need the number 2 hex drive, and that's for the small screw at the bottom of the bell cap. You're going to need 4 washers that are less the diameter of the inside of the shock barrel, and you're going to need 4 1/10 scale shocks. You will need a 15/64 drill bit or really close to it, and that's going to be to modify the shock body from the 1/10 scale shock, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. Okay, so next up, you're going to disassemble all 4 of your 1/10 scale shocks. Now, for this, I used traxxas shocks that I had left over from a rustler. Okay, so once you take apart the shock, you have all these little pieces, and then you have what's called the shock body. And this is the part that we're looking for. Once you get everything stripped off of it and you get the oil drained out, set it to the side for a moment and continue doing that with the rest of the shocks. Okay, now that we have all 4 of our 1/10 scale shock bodies, we're ready to modify them. One of the things that we have to do is we have to make sure that the shock body can actually slip around your 8S Traxxas X-Maxx shock shaft. So what we have to do is we have to drill out the top of this hole right here so that it can accept this size of a shock shaft. And to do that, I'm using a 15/64 size drill bit. It doesn't really matter what size drill bit that you use, just as long as when you're done, it will slip over this shock shaft. Once you've modified all 4 of your shock shafts and you've cleaned all of the debris from drilling the shock shafts, set them aside with all 4 of your washers for the project in a little while. Okay guys, next step, we're going to disassemble our 8S Traxxas shock, and basically we're taking our number 2 hex driver here and we're going to remove the tiny screw that keeps the bottom bell cap attached to the shock. We'll remove the spring, and then we're going to flip the shock over, remove the shock cap. You should find a little rubber gasket under here, or they call it a bladder. You're going to remove that. You're going to drain the oil out of your shock. Set your bladder to the side, set your shock cap to the side. You're going to want to get your 7mm socket again. So you're going to remove the nut that's on the inside of here, and you'll see it there. Now what that's going to allow you to do is to pull this shock shaft completely through. Once you have that, inside the shock body, you have your plunger. So I usually use the shock shaft the other direction to kind of work your plunger out. What you don't want to do is you don't want to scratch everything on the inside of your shock body. So we're going to work out our little plunger. We're going to set that over to the side as well. You also have a tiny washer in here as well. And basically what this washer is for is it will slide onto the shock shaft, and now your plunger will slide onto the washer, and then the nut will actually go on top of that and screw everything down nice and tight. So what we're actually doing here, this would normally sit inside this shock, and your shock travel is basically depicted on how far this plunger can travel to the bottom of the shock body. What we're going to do is we're going to install one of these shock bodies. So the plunger is going to now hit the top of the shock shaft and effectively not allow the shock to travel all the way out. So now that we have everything apart, what we're going to do is we're going to install our shock body. This is the order that this needs to be. Basically, you have your shock body, you have your shock shaft. Insert your shock shaft inside of the shock body like you normally would. Instead of putting the small washer in first like you normally would, this time we're going to insert our large washer, and then we're going to insert the 1/10 scale shock body over the shock shaft, and then we're going to insert the stock small washer, and that goes on the shock shaft like we took a look at earlier. After that, it's going to be the plunger. So we're going to stick the plunger in nice and even, and then just work that down with your finger until the plunger fits around the shock shaft. I just take the nut and I put it right inside the socket, and then I get that screwed into place. Now that we put that shock body in there, it is impeding the travel to our shock. It's not allowing it to actually come out all the way. So now it's starting to resemble this shock, which has already been done. Now we're going to complete the rest of the assembly to the shock as we would normally do, with one exception. This time, we're going to refill our shock with oil like we did normally, except for when we bleed out the bubbles, you have to keep in mind this time that there's a shock body in here that's also trapping air. So you have to get all the bubbles out. You have to keep refilling this until it doesn't give you any more air bubbles. And it could take quite some time. Set it to the side for 10 or 15 minutes and then come back and check and see if you have any bubbles left. We're going to do that now, and we'll check on this shock in just a minute. Okay, so basically after you get everything worked out with the bubbles, you're going to go ahead and reseat your bladder, get everything twisted back on real good. And remember, only hand tighten this, because all you're going to do is ruin that bladder inside. So you get everything all cleaned up and reassembled, get everything looking just like this shock here, and back on the X-Maxx, and you're ready to rock and roll. Now that we got everything put back together, you can obviously see things are a bit lower to the ground now, and it's going to help out in many ways. Just be sure to remember a couple things. One, you can do this with any size of shock body as far as length. You could even cut the shock body down if you want just a little bit out of your shocks. Just remember, if you do anything cutting or drilling, to make sure you clean it up before you install it inside of the new shock body. You don't want any debris rolling around in the oil. Also, you definitely want to remember not to bash this truck. It's not for jumping anymore, especially with just a tiny bit of shock travel left. But for me, I've had my X-Maxx for quite some time, and now I'm going to get back on the speed run. Until next time, guys, it's Brian, an amazing RC. I'll get you guys another really cool video very, very soon.